Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. We basically took a week off for the National Hurricane Conference, and we replayed an episode with Joe Hernandez, like basically the father of medical USAR, which was during the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. And so we encourage you again to take a look back at that. But we're starting to move forward again. We're really excited to have the state director of Vermont, specifically of VEM, Director Erica Bornemann, on the show. She has a lot of experience. In fact, right before we started recording, she was talking all about how she basically grew up through the ranks in emergency management. I really think this is great experience for you guys, and so we're going to be talking about that. She has definitely done it right, and so we're excited to have her on the show. Erica, welcome.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's dive right into it. I mean, you were talking about how several years ago you started as an intern in the planning section, correct, of VM?
That's correct. I was a poli-sci major at Western New England College, and I didn't even know that emergency management was a thing. I had really never even strung together the two words emergency management. And I just happened to get an internship with the City of Springfield, Massachusetts Office of Emergency Preparedness. And it was a life-changing experience. And they said, every state has an emergency management office. You should, when you go home for winter break, ask to take a tour of the State Emergency Operations Center. And I said, that's a great idea. And I did, and just so happened to have my resume with me. And they immediately wanted to bring on an intern. And it was a really fantastic experience because I got not only a more urban experience in emergency management at the city level, and then I went to the state level in a pretty rural state, and started building out some experience there. Plans, I was a strong writer coming out of college, and I went straight into my master's program while I was working full time. And so that, I was a natural planner, and so that was a really good fit for me. Kind of came up through the ranks, worked in the radiological program while Vermont Yankee was still operating for a number of years. Took on a leadership role with the planning section as the section chief. And then spent a couple of years as our director's chief of staff. And then Governor Scott appointed me in 2017 as the director of emergency management. And I have been so blessed to be able to bring my passion for helping Vermonters, and especially on their worst day and after their worst day. And Vermont being my home state, I'm even more blessed because these are my friends and neighbors, and I get to help them every time a disaster strikes.
So there's so many things that you just said in there that I want to highlight, but let's pull it back real fast because you're talking about being from Vermont. Now, I'm like, full disclosure, of like the 7 people who live in the state, I know about 30% of them, and every single person I've met from Vermont, they figured it out. Like, people are just good people from Vermont, and so just like having that as your background alone, like, gave me an extra 2 points of like, oh, no wonder she's good at what she does. You're talking about being a natural planner. I really found that for myself too. Like, I worked in operations and planning, and just having that like natural mindset of like how planning works in that strategic, I wouldn't say mindset or vision has really helped me out. But in terms of the attributes of an emergency manager, especially now as the state director, and you're working with all different types of sections, even the radiological section, which I want to dive into later, can you talk about almost like the DNA of an emergency manager, of like, what are the attributes like that will naturally help people propel in the field?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I know there's a lot of conversation about that right now because we're seeing a lot more people pursue emergency management as a career path, which is super exciting because, of course, that's what I did, and not even knowing that's what I was doing, but I have done that, and what I've learned in going on 16 years 16 years next year in emergency management, is that we're really looking for skill sets, not necessarily a specific background. I want to know that somebody can be a good critical thinker, can think out of the side of the box and be a problem solver. I want to know that they can use technology these days, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, a real tech guru. I just need to know that you can operate efficiently with technology, because that's what we're using, and we need to be able to be creative with it. I want to know that you can frankly be a hard worker and not be afraid to jump in and put yourself in something that might be a little bit of an uncomfortable situation. Working in an EOC is stressful. It's intimidating. People come into, external partners come into the EOC, and they can be a little nervous until they get into the swing of it and go, oh, I can do this. So having somebody that can really jump in and do it with focus and understand how to take direction and make something from potentially minimal direction and really accomplish the goal. I know I'm asking for probably what is a unicorn. I just, I want everything, but those those are just some of the attributes that we're looking for. And if we can demonstrate as somebody that's a candidate for a position that you are articulate, both in verbally and in writing, and that you are a critical thinker and can think outside of the box, you're already 3 steps ahead of so many other candidates, because oftentimes we can get into the and I hate to call it like a stick in the mud, but you don't want to become the stick in the mud that has to have every single thing mapped out.
Oh my gosh.
Your procedures are important. They really are, but you cannot live and die by procedures. You have to be able to think outside of the box and be creative.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at L3Harris.com right now. The Readiness Lab is trailblazing disaster readiness. Early access for the highly anticipated course, Emergency Management Response for Dynamic Populations, is currently live. Think you have what it takes? Join us in Atlanta for an immersive experience. Space is limited to 40. Go to thereadinesslab.com/training to learn more. Okay, let's jump back in. So, we're not going to do this, but this really should be like our shortest podcast ever. I just want to take what you just said, the transcript, make it an article, and submit it to every news organization I could possibly think of, or magazine. I mean, everything you just said there is exactly how I look at it. Is exactly like P. Gaynor has been a frequent flyer on our podcast. He wrote just an amazing article about emergency management 3.0 is what that's really what he should have called his article. But everything you just said there, it's I just want to grab it and give it to every candidate that I know, because you're talking about being 3 steps ahead of other candidates. I run a private company now, and I look at candidates. I look at resumes all the time. And I did it when I was in FEMA. We would hire local hires all the time when we go out these disasters. And you could tell, what I would call the type 1, type 2, or type 3 mentality. If people who are type 3 cannot get out of that, oh, I have a process. I was taught ICS in school. I have this form that I have to do, or I have to talk to this, or I don't have to talk to that stakeholder. That's not my job. And those people are slow. They don't get the job done. Other people like yourself, or Patrick McGinn, so another person who's been on the show, Kevin Coleman, Andy John, Ashley Loria Golden, people who have been on here who say similar things. What I would say, they're kind of like the people who don't get tired. Even if you're exhausted, you can still perform at an optimal level. And so again, everything you just said right there, just like want to like, yes, like everybody just replay this episode right now of everything she just said 3 times and then continue to the next part. You're
Well,
talking, yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like, like it's great to have Energizer bunnies. The critical thinking also is about being able to think strategically about what you're trying to accomplish. And
Yeah,
and
you
it's finding
don't just go
different
around the
lanes.
rabbit hole. Yeah.
Right. And so it's finding different lanes to get there. So there are moments where thinking strategically about the best method to accomplish that goal is what's necessary.
Mm.
But when I say we need critical thinkers to do that, we need people that can find those other lanes to get to the same goal and not just use the same old methods that frankly don't work anymore.
That's correct. The methods of the past don't work. Like there's a reason why emergency management truly is in its infancy, and which makes me want to ask you a question. I'm going to put you on the spot here. If I ask 100 emergency managers, and for the people who listen to the show frequently, they might die a little bit inside of this. But if I ask 100 emergency managers, what's the definition of emergency management? I might get 100 different answers. But because you just led with like this great segment, if you had to give your definition of emergency management, what it should be rather than what it was, what would you say your definition is?
Oh gosh. You're gonna make me say a sentence?
Okay, I'll give you one caveat though. You can't say the words whole community. If I hear another definition with whole community in it, I might die inside. Yeah, that's
no, but you know what? The word that is used a lot is coordination, and I know people. It can be a little bit of a cliche word, but find me a better word for the hub on the wheel, and the center point of everything, pre, during, and after disasters.
yeah.
And that is what emergency management is. And I think for there's emergency management requires an inherent trust in us to do really good coordination work, because it can be a little bit intimidating or I don't know if that's the right word, but it may take a little bit of time to gain trust from an external partner to come into the EOC and they can feel like they're kind of giving up some of their authority when they're not truly at all. But when they fully understand what emergency management is and does and the value of it, it's then that builds the trust, and then it allows the system to work in that hub and spoke model, which is so important for emergency management. So that's not a definition, but
I really so you said the magic word, and the magic word is coordination. I've had to since update my definition. I actually used to use this for emergency management. Now I'm going to use it for emergency services. So my definition of emergency services is the protection of life, property, and continuity of operation. And emergency management is the strategic coordination of emergency services. And if you really if you can't
very articulate, John.
Well, I'm trying to get hired at VEM, and so no, but I've thought about it a lot, and I've been on these forums and these conversations, and you get these massive definitions and they become redundant. But yeah, the emergency manager should be the hub. And I get I've been using this phrase too much on this podcast, speaking of articulation, is dying inside. But when people say emergency management is public safety, they negate all the emergency managers who work for campuses, who work for organizations. I worked for a hospital system, for example, in DC 10 years ago. And so I think we have to pull away from this is not just government. Obviously, government has its place. But I've had, again, not trying to be that guy, but 3 FEMA admins all admitting on the show that most of FEMA doesn't do emergency management. So why are we calling FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, when only a small segment does that? And really, state organizations do much more EM because they get the funding, the grants from FEMA, and then they actually do something with it. And so I like to call FEMA the IRS of disasters. And again, former FEMA guy, I love FEMA. But if you're going through the ranks here and you're working in planning, radiation, working with the state, working directly with stakeholders who are coordinating all that stuff, then yeah, like the state really is that hub, or whatever organization you're working with is that hub. So this is kind of my thought process.
Yeah, I think that's very thought provoking and an interesting perspective on the work that FEMA does. I think when you made the point about public safety and that emergency management is public safety, I think it diminishes the work of our hazard mitigation folks
Oh my
and
gosh.
all
Yeah.
of our intelligence analysts and and we don't want to diminish prevention above it. We cannot be diminishing hazard mitigation and prevention to response. And frankly,
Yeah.
I think we have evolved as a profession. When I first started, there was a lot of emphasis on response. That was where most of our employees were. We spent a lot of emphasis on making sure that our folks were really trained in the EOC to be able to respond. But you know what? And that's very important. Well, we don't spend the majority of our time responding.
That's right.
The majority of our time preventing and preparing and mitigating disasters. So
Yeah.
we cannot diminish that role. And I'm happy to see. I think when you look at FEMA, I think when you look at a lot of other state emergency management offices and at the local level as well, the role of your mitigators and the role of your intelligence analysts and your planners is really has been elevated, I think, over the past 15 years at least since I've been in, and there's I think an acknowledgement of the importance of their work.
Yeah, I agree. I have also heard that COOP and business impact assessments are not EM, and you're like, hey, if again emergency services and coordinating that is life, property, continuity of operations, how do you know how many people are you're supposed to help? How do you know how much property is going to be impacted? How do you know what business functions have to run without data and again, I'm a former GIS unit leader, so I love data. I'm a big data guy, but to cut out situational awareness, to cut out mitigation, which is, it's again, this is a kind of a repeat episode, a little bit some of these phrases, but disaster tough. Like I'm tired of resiliency. People thinking like the goal is to be resilient. That should be a function. Resiliency should be a byproduct of all the other things that you're doing. You can't be resilient if you don't have plans and products and supply chain and everything else in place to be able to be resilient. It doesn't come out of thin air. But if you do
as much as we try and measure it, there's really no good measure of resilience because we can't even land on a common definition. So, you're right. It's a byproduct, and it's a goal to work towards. But I don't know that full resilience. It may be too lofty. We have to be more resilient, but full resilience it may be too lofty, and it's just much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I'm kind of tired of the subjective ideas. Like we should be able to define exactly what we do and how we do it, and take. I push back on cookie cutter, but I'm a big fan of template. Like you shouldn't just plug in and not think. But if your template is essentially working with stakeholders and making sure your supply chain and mitigating known hazards based off of data, not just opinion, then you can actually start pushing the needle to all these different areas. And lo and behold, when you do response, you inherently are more resilient because you're making that disaster tough decisions. You're able to push back on the disaster. Building codes, the fact that building codes, which is essentially mitigation, isn't like the leader when people who work on building codes, it's like the number one reason why Japan didn't have buildings falling down during a 9.0 earthquake in Fukushima disaster, and it was really a tsunami and or a people problem. Building codes work, and yet we focus on response. Now, my one pushback on all of that is that I do hear some say that emergency managers shouldn't be in response, and we can't take out the word emergency out of emergency management. Like, we still need to focus on everything reducing that emergency, but we need to be able to act when there's an emergency, right?
Well, gosh, I've never heard that before.
Oh my gosh,
That
I could replay you some of the others, and I love those people who've been on the show. In fact, everybody has great points, but I've heard a couple people on this show specifically say we shouldn't be in response anymore, and you're like, hey,
goodness
wait,
gracious.
yeah, like,
I
hold up.
mean, I just I'll point to I'll point to examples, and maybe this is maybe I just need to dig into this some more because I need to pull that thread apart a little bit. But
Hmm.
how like our role in response is I think very critical, especially when you talk about the fact that our core mission in response is to provide support to the incident command elements in the field, right? And
Yes.
so, and I get this question a lot. Well, who's in command of those resources? We assign them to the element in the field, and they're in
Mhm.
command, and then we take them back when they demobilize because there's a resource prioritization that happens based on requests, and you mobilize your assets. They go under the command of folks that need them on the ground, and then they come back. And I mean, that may be, it's probably oversimplifying it, but our core role is to provide support wherever that may be, situational awareness, actual assets, logistical support, and to do it in a coordinated fashion so that we're not duplicating efforts. And we've seen it a lot. We see it in event. Every event, there's still duplicated efforts. There's less and less as emergency management as a function is out in front and folks understand the value, but it still happens. You still have, X person calling Y person because they've got a relationship, and that's fine. But that really underscores the importance of why we need to have those relationships before the disaster, so that we can cut down on that redundancy and duplication of efforts. And frankly, all of what I just described puts people's life at risk. You have a slower response when you're not efficient and you're not coordinated. You're putting people's lives at risk. You're putting their recovery at risk.
Mhm.
So I mean, I'm the passionate emergency manager, and that understands and will always hold the doctrine dear. I've seen how disasters that are not coordinated, where you didn't have an emergency coordination element across multiple agencies, cannot work well, and I've seen when
Yeah.
it works really well.
I was deployed to a very small flooding event that happened to have while we were there, right before we deployed, a tornado hit another small community, and so it turned out to be pretty good that we went there. But we were a federal team, and the locals didn't want to work together, and so we went out there essentially to play nice and to help, and we were much more capable than what was required, and very costly. But it was like, hey guys, like, you're on the same team. Like, it all comes down to the survivor. I've also seen it firsthand, and working with NGOs before my federal time, and it's like, my gosh, like, again, I just like want to take this episode. You're saying all the right stuff, and like, emergency management in that truest form is coordination. And you have a catastrophic disaster. I like to tell my first responder counterparts, like, when I go to USAR training, I help out and teach them like what EM is. I said that the role of an emergency manager in your job is to get the debris out of your way so that you can do your job. The other thing you're talking about, like, who has the authority? I've said this several times. It's like the big joke is that emergency management isn't a manager because they don't have the authority, and it's like the biggest trick in the book is like, oh, you're the
Mhm.
manager, so we think you have the authority, but really, like, what you just said, like when you hand over the resources, I say it in probably I want to say a dumber way, but a simpler way is it's like I treat adults like adults. Like you hire and work with competent people who are experts in what they do. I'm not their expert. They're the expert. And so I'm going to make sure that they have the resources that they can function with and work with them in that win-win environment. And case in point, Hurricane Harvey versus Hurricane Maria. Largest hurricane in U.S. history, knocked it out of the park because you had an entire team of very competent people versus a very passionate team but inexperienced team that didn't know what they were doing, and they ended up getting fired, right? Because like they were just too slow and it hurt the survivors, and so like they had to kind of reset. So again, you're saying all the right stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your point about authority is one that I want to expand on a little bit more too. I'm currently the sitting president of the National Emergency Management Association, and this is something that my counterparts as state directors talk about quite a bit is authority. And it's very, very important that your laws and your policies are really clear about the authority of the emergency manager. In Vermont, it's very clear that the Director of Emergency Management, as delegated to our Commissioner of Public Safety, has the authority to and is charged with deploying those assets and ensuring that there's a coordinated disaster response. It can be a lot more nuanced than that because you get egos involved and then it all goes to crap. But
well, you're talking about like old school versus new.
Is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're talking about old school versus new school. Old school of like command and control, like I have to have all the authority versus coordinate and collaborate, which is like so. I was talking to Patrick McGinn again. I got just brought up. We were talking about how in Free Guy, how he went and took off the glasses of the person he needed to get the glasses from, and we're like, oh, that's the emergency manager. Like we're asking politely, but we're just gonna do it anyways. Like we're just still gonna. We know our mission, right? So we're gonna get it no matter what.
We're asking politely, but we also have the authority to
absolutely. And your authority.
We don't get anywhere by doing that. We don't get anywhere by saying you must do this. I mean, and I've seen emergency managers that are like that, and they just you. It's like that old saying: you attract more flies with honey, and you can accomplish a lot more when everybody sees the value, and that's what I try and emphasize when we're doing exercises or when we're doing when we're in response in the EOC is that we in emergency management we can't do our job without the help and the work of all of the other agencies that are at the table. We are in a team. This is a team. We may be the stewards of that team, but we don't. But we are not. And if needed, we can. If somebody wants to be obstinate, we have the authority to pull that thread. But we don't need to get there. There's really no need to. I know that sounds really pie in the sky and somewhat naive.
Oh, I don't think it does. Yeah,
it works. It works for us.
Well, the authority gets you in the room, and you don't have to pull the card unless you have to. Like again, the best emergency manager is almost like let's say a salesman, but like somebody who can understand like the mission and get people on the side to be able to coordinate. Again, that word of the episode. I like what you said, like hub and spoke, like all that stuff that happens. There's not a single group who can do it, and I've seen it as well. Man, there was this bullheaded guy that would always try to do that, and then he would wonder why like he couldn't get the things done that he wanted to, even though he had the authority. It's because people just didn't care. Like, hey, like I have 100 other things to do. There's people out there being impacted. I have something I can do to help them. I don't care about you. And like they didn't make the time versus other people who really invested in people and those relationships with people. And man, Rodney Melsick, all the authority in the world, for example. And man, it's weird watching him. Like he would like people like would bend over backwards everywhere he went to help him and to do and he would just kind of like nudge everyone along. And you would never assume that he was again, he also was an A-type personality either, which is very rare for our industry. But like he just wanted to help him, and he was very good at getting the job done because of that. And that's kind of what you're talking about. Again, you have to have the authority, you have to have the politician to either give you delegations of authority or whomever, but
I
probably shouldn't
mean,
use that card, right?
I think one of the key characteristics, especially of an emergency management leader, and we talk about emergency managers, but an emergency management leader has to be an empathetic leader. They have to have emotional intelligence, and they have to be able to understand and use intuition to understand how to get the best results. That's harder
Yeah.
to develop. That's not something that's inherent in everybody. But I mean, I have so many uh, directors and emergency managers across the country that I get to work with on a daily basis in my NEMA role, and they are just amazing role models of empathetic leaders that
Mhm.
lead by example, that just set the path, and they've hired the right people, and they are empowering them to do something great. And I think that's really important for emergency managers of the future and our next generation that's coming in, because that's they're there to help people. People get into emergency management because they want to help people. And
Yes.
so if we are as emergency management leaders putting stumbling blocks and finding every single reason to say no, we're not going to get results, and then we can't wonder why we didn't get results.
Oh, don't you love that? That's like my favorite thing. Like, oh, why didn't this happen? It's like, well, you push back on every idea or every concept, even data. Like maybe this is kind of a funny way to end the episode, but like I get so much. I love how you started off by talking about like data and situational awareness and mitigation of and these ideas and intelligence. Intelligence, to be honest, in emergency management is much further behind the curve than where it could be. If we look at our first responder or even military counterparts who come into the field and they have so much intelligence at their disposal and intelligence units, I was working on a project that used artificial intelligence to figure out through aerial imagery how much damage in real time a disaster would be. Compare that to like the ground teams who are doing like PDAs, like preliminary damage assessments, and how long that takes and that validation process versus like what we could do. And so you're hitting on all pistons here again. You're talking about that the next level emergency manager, the next round of emergency managers who are coming through. Again, I don't think what you're talking about is being a unicorn. I think it's your word, right? Uh, you should you should, as a listener of this podcast, really be taking a lot of this in. You know, when we're talking about like these concepts, these ideas that the type of people we're looking for, people who can collaborate with other people who are getting the authority but not having to use it, people who are great at building relationships and understanding a plan and strategic vision and reducing impacts of disaster, but can go when a disaster hits. Again, those are all the attributes of a humanitarian who happens to like emergency management, and which is really who we should be. Um, as a leader yourself, I don't know if I should call you just director or Director Bornemann, but
Erica is fine.
Erica, I don't know. It sounds. I like how you like just like quietly just like drop that you're the president of NEMA too. That's pretty awesome. It shows that you're the real deal. As a leader, trying to give advice to or providing advice to the next next round of potential leaders out there. If you're going to end this podcast about talking about what it takes to be a leader, what would you tell them?
I've hit on some of the items before, and I'll just emphasize again the emotional intelligence needed to be a good leader. This being a leader is about setting an example, and I've had some really great mentors that really just drove that point home. That they walk in every day, and you want to emulate who they are. You would go to bat for them. You would go to the end of the earth for them. And they didn't even try, really. They didn't look like they tried, because they were good people and they cared about you. And I think that's really, really inherent. That's really important. It's something that I try and emulate. Not always good at it. Not everybody's good at it.
Mm.
But they are, that's the leader I try to be, and that's the type of leader I look for with our team of my deputy and section chiefs. Those are the people we're trying to get them to manage to the individual, and it can be hard when you have a big shop. I don't have a really big shop. I have the luxury of being able to really establish those relationships with individuals, and that's what's important from a supervisor, manager, leader is understanding what your employee needs, what your people need, and then opening the path and empowering them to do it.
Man, talk about mic drop moment. Yeah, I would kind of like to end with that. We at Doberman Emergency Management, every new hire has to go through this new hire packet, and in the new hire packet, it talks about how we judge success in our company, and we talk about three attributes. We talk about ambition, we talk about high intelligence, and the third one is following a personal moral code.
Mm.
And if you do those three things in our company, or I would believe at VEM or any other organization that has integrity, then you're going to start to establish yourself as somebody who can get the job done and lead people. Those three things, again, at the end of the day, I almost want to figure out how Amin, for our producer, is going to figure out the name of this episode. It's going to be about some, like, good people, Director Bornemann, good people. But like, you also, like, again, a last feather to your cap. You're from Vermont, which everybody I know from Vermont is a good person. You grew up through the ranks. You've been doing this for a while, and you're holding your own, and you're saying the right things. So you got those three things going for you. And then we're going to go a nice shout out to Zach Borst, who said, "Hey, please have her on the show." And he's good people. He follows those three attributes as well that we just talked about. And so,
Yeah.
again, Erica, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to me. I would like you to be a frequent flyer yourself because you're saying all the right stuff. And maybe we can drill into some of those other areas when we have you back.
I would love that, John. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation.
Okay, everybody. If you like this episode, here's our shameless plug. You got to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe. Let us know in all of our social media posts, whether it's Disaster Tough on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you go. Put a comment in saying what you liked, a question you might have. If you have a specific question for Erica or for the field, put it in those comments. If you have something that you would like to send her, that you have you want to work at VEM, for example, you're like, hey, I'm a leader, I would like to work there. Send us an email at contact@thereadinesslab.com. Again, that's contact@thereadinesslab.com, and we'll send it over to her for her review. And hopefully we just landed another leader at VEM. So we'll take it from there, and we'll see you next week.